April 30th, 1945. Berlin. The Führerbunker. A man sits in a concrete room 15 meters underground while the city above him burns. Soviet artillery shells are landing blocks away. The Red Army is closing in. His regime, which he promised would last 1,000 years, has days left. His name is Adolf Hitler, and he's about to kill himself. Outside the bunker, Berlin is rubble. The Wehrmacht, once the most feared military force in Europe, is a collection of old men and children with rifles. The concentration camps are being liberated. The evidence of genocide is being discovered. The world is learning what happened. The regime that swore it would reshape human civilization lasted exactly 12 years. From 1933 to 1945. 12 years. Not 1,000, not a century, not even a generation. 12 years of total war, industrial murder, and the systematic destruction of everything Germany had built over centuries. This isn't a story about a tragic empire that fell from greatness. This is a case study in how quickly a modern society can collapse into authoritarianism, commit unspeakable atrocities, and then implode under the weight of its own contradictions. So how does a democracy become a dictatorship? How does propaganda replace reality? Stay with me. Because understanding how Nazi Germany collapsed isn't just about the past. It's about recognizing the warning signs before they appear again. If you're here to understand history, not to glorify it, but to learn from it, hit subscribe, because this is a story that can't be forgotten. Let's start where it actually begins. Not with Hitler's rise, but with Germany's collapse. November 11th, 1918. Germany surrenders. World War I is over. 4 years of industrialized slaughter. 2 million German soldiers dead. 4 million wounded. The economy in ruins. Cities starving. And Germany didn't lose on German soil. When the armistice was signed, German troops still occupied foreign territory. To many Germans, this didn't feel like a military defeat. It felt like betrayal. The stab-in-the-back myth began almost immediately. Right-wing nationalists claimed Germany hadn't been defeated on the battlefield. It had been betrayed by socialists, communists, and Jews on the home front. This was a lie. Germany's military had collapsed. The naval blockade had starved the country. The army was exhausted, supplies gone, allies defeated. But the lie was more comfortable than the truth. And lies, once planted, grow. The Treaty of Versailles made everything worse. Signed in June 1919, the treaty forced Germany to accept full responsibility for the war, pay massive reparations of 132 billion gold marks, give up 13% of its territory, surrender all colonies, limit its military to 100,000 men, and demilitarize the Rhineland. France wanted revenge. Britain wanted stability. The United States wanted peace. Germany got humiliation. The treaty wasn't just punitive, it was designed to be felt as punishment. German delegates weren't allowed to negotiate. They were presented with terms and told to sign. When they returned to Germany, they were seen as traitors who'd accepted a dictated peace. The Weimar Republic, Germany's new democratic government, was born under this shadow. From day one, it was associated with defeat, shame, and foreign domination. Democracy in Germany started as the system that signed the surrender. In 1923, Germany experienced hyperinflation so severe it became a textbook case of economic collapse. The government, unable to meet reparation payments, printed money, more money, and more. The value of the German mark collapsed. In January 1923, $1 was worth 18,000 marks. By November, $1 was worth 4.2 trillion marks. Prices doubled every few days. Workers were paid twice daily because their wages would be worthless by evening. People brought wheelbarrows full of cash to buy bread. Life savings evaporated overnight. A pensioner who'd saved for retirement discovered their life's work could buy a loaf of bread. The middle class, the backbone of any stable democracy, was destroyed. Farmers hoarded food rather than sell it for worthless paper. Cities starved. Riots broke out. The government seemed powerless, and then the economy stabilized. A new currency, the Rentenmark, was introduced. Reparations were restructured. By the mid-1920s, Germany was recovering. The Weimar Republic looked like it might survive. But the trauma remained. The memory of chaos. The fear that it could happen again. And in 1929, it did. October 1929. The American stock market crashed. Within months, the global economy collapsed. Banks failed. Factories closed. Unemployment exploded. Germany, dependent on American loans to pay reparations, was devastated. Unemployment went from 1.3 million in September 1929 to over 6 million by early 1932. Nearly a third of German workers had no jobs. Young men who'd grown up in the chaos of post-war Germany, who'd seen their parents' savings destroyed by hyperinflation, now couldn't find work. They stood in bread lines, watched their families struggle, looked for someone to blame. And political movements on both the extreme left and extreme right told them exactly who to blame. The Weimar Republic had a constitution, elections, political parties, a free press, but proportional representation meant too many parties held seats. No one could form a majority. Governments collapsed, and emergency decrees became routine. When the economy collapsed, the political center collapsed with it. Moderate parties lost support. Extremists gained. On the left, the Communist Party promised revolution, redistribute wealth, overthrow capitalism, follow the Soviet model. On the right, nationalist and fascist movements promised order, restore German pride, reclaim what was lost, punish those responsible. Street violence became routine. Communist paramilitaries, the Rotfront-Kämpferbund, clashed with Nazi brownshirts, the Sturmabteilung, pitched battles in the streets, hundreds killed, thousands wounded. The government seemed unable to maintain order. And in that chaos, the Nazi Party grew. Adolf Hitler wasn't a political genius. He was an opportunist who understood how to exploit crisis. Born in Austria in 1889, Hitler moved to Munich before World War I, served in the German army, was wounded, decorated for bravery. When the war ended, he was hospitalized, temporarily blinded by a gas attack. When he learned of Germany's surrender, he later claimed it was the worst moment of his life. He blamed Jews, communists, and Democrats for the defeat. In 1919, Hitler joined a tiny nationalist group, the German Workers' Party. Within 2 years, he'd taken it over and renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. Hitler discovered he could speak, not in the measured tones of a politician, but with raw emotional fury. He told audiences what they wanted to hear. Germany was betrayed. The Treaty of Versailles is a crime. Jews and communists are destroying the nation. We will restore greatness. It was simple. emotional, built on resentment and scapegoating. In 1923, Hitler attempted a coup, the Beer Hall Putsch in Munich. It failed. He was arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He served 9 months. While imprisoned, he dictated Mein Kampf, My Struggle, part autobiography, part political manifesto. It laid out his worldview: racial superiority, anti-Semitism, Lebensraum, living space for Germans in the East, expansionism, and contempt for democracy. Few people read it carefully. Those who did should have been terrified. When Hitler was released, he reorganized the Nazi Party. He'd learned from the failed coup. You can't seize power by force in a democracy. You have to win elections first. Then destroy democracy from within. Between 1930 and 1933, Germany had 4 chancellors. None could form stable governments. The Reichstag was paralyzed. President Paul von Hindenburg, a World War I general, 84 years old, ruled increasingly by emergency decree. Democracy was dying, not from a coup, from gridlock and chaos. Conservative politicians thought they could control Hitler, use his popularity, then discard him. Former Chancellor Franz von Papen convinced Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as Chancellor, with von Papen as Vice-Chancellor. The cabinet would be filled with traditional conservatives. They'd keep Hitler in check. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. That night, the SA staged a massive torchlight parade through Berlin. Tens of thousands of brown shirts marching past the chancellery. Hitler stood at a window, watching, tears in his eyes. Democracy hadn't been overthrown. It had been handed over. Through the mid-1920s, the Nazi Party was marginal. In the 1928 elections, they won 2.6% of the vote, 12 seats in the Reichstag. But when the Depression hit, everything changed. The Nazi message, simple, emotional, built on anger and fear, resonated. Germany is suffering because of the Treaty of Versailles, because of Jews, because of communists, because weak democratic politicians sold out the nation. We will restore order, make Germany strong again, give you jobs, give you pride. Hitler didn't offer policy details. He offered emotion, rage, hope, belonging. The Nazi Party rallies were spectacles, torchlight parades, martial music, uniforms, symbols. Hitler's speeches, delivered with theatrical fury, promised redemption through strength. And critically, the Nazis were funded. Some German industrialists and business elites, terrified of communism, poured money into the Nazi Party. They saw Hitler as a useful tool to crush the left. They were wrong. But by the time they realized it, it was too late. In the September 1930 elections, the Nazi Party won 18.3% of the vote, 107 seats, the second largest party in the Reichstag. 2 years later, in July 1932, they won 37.4%, 230 seats, the largest party. Not a majority, but enough to be unavoidable. What is that skip you feel in your chest? This brings us to the most common and most benign glitch in the system, the premature contraction. March 23rd, 1933. The Reichstag met in the Kroll Opera House. The Parliament building was still damaged from the fire. Hitler proposed the Enabling Act. It would allow his government to pass laws without the Reichstag's approval, to govern by decree. He promised it would only be used in emergencies. For 4 years. To restore order, the Reichstag voted. 441 in favor. 94 against. The Social Democrats voted no. The Communists weren't there. Most were in prison or in hiding. The Catholic Centre Party and other conservative parties voted yes, believing Hitler's assurances. With the Enabling Act, Hitler no longer needed the Reichstag. He could make laws by decree. Democracy was over. The dictatorship had legal cover, and Hitler had achieved it through elections and laws, not a coup. The Nazis called it Gleichschaltung, coordination. The process of bringing every aspect of German society under Nazi control. It happened fast. Political parties were banned. By July 1933, the Nazi Party was the only legal party. Trade unions were dissolved, replaced by the German Labour Front, controlled by the Nazis. State governments were subordinated to the central government. Federalism was abolished. The civil service was purged. Jews and political opponents were fired. The judiciary lost independence. Courts were pressured to rule in favor of the regime. The media was placed under state control. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, controlled newspapers, radio, and film. What Germans read, heard, and watched was filtered through Nazi ideology. Education was Nazified. Textbooks rewritten. Teachers required to join the Nazi Teachers League. Children were taught racial biology, militarism, and obedience to the Führer. Culture was controlled. Books were burned. Works by Jewish authors, communists, and anyone deemed un-German. In May 1933, students and SA members piled books in public squares and set them on fire. Works by Heinrich Heine, Sigmund Freud, Albert Einstein, and countless others went up in flames. Churches were pressured to conform. Some resisted. Most accommodated. Youth organizations were replaced by the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls. Children were indoctrinated from age 10, taught to idolize Hitler, to see Jews as enemies, to glorify war. Within 2 years, nearly every institution in Germany had been brought under Nazi control. Not through mass violence, through bureaucracy, intimidation, and opportunism. People who resisted were arrested. People who accommodated were rewarded. Most people went along because it was easier, safer, and sometimes profitable. Joseph Goebbels understood something fundamental. If you control information, you control reality. The Nazi regime didn't just lie, it created an alternate reality. Rallies in Nuremberg, massive spectacles with tens of thousands of participants, columns of soldiers, banners, torchlight. Hitler speaking from a podium designed to make him look larger than life. Filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl turned these rallies into propaganda films, Triumph of the Will, shot with revolutionary camera techniques, edited to create emotional impact. No narration needed, just images of power, order, unity. These weren't documentaries. They were myth-making. Radio broadcasts reached every German home. Hitler's speeches, Goebbels' diatribes, carefully crafted messages reinforcing the party line. Newspapers printed only what the regime allowed. And Germans, bombarded with propaganda daily, began to believe. Or at least, they stopped questioning. When you hear the same message from every source, when dissent is invisible, when the alternative is silence or prison, belief becomes compliance, becomes habit. The regime looked strong, organized, in control. But beneath the propaganda, it was fragile, paranoid, and built on violence. The Nazis claimed they restored order after the chaos of Weimar, and on the surface, it looked true. Unemployment fell. Not because the economy magically recovered, but because the regime conscripted men into the military, built autobahns and infrastructure using forced labor, rearmed in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, and excluded Jews and women from employment statistics. The economic miracle was built on rearmament and deficit spending. It was unsustainable. But in the short term, it worked. People had jobs. The economy seemed stable. Street violence decreased, not because society was healthier, but because the SA and SS had a monopoly on violence. Political opponents were in camps or silent. Crime statistics fell, not because crime decreased, but because the Gestapo, the secret police, operated outside the law. Arrests, torture, and murder didn't appear in crime statistics if the state was doing it. Germany looked orderly. But order isn't peace, it's control. And control requires ever-increasing repression. March 1933. Just weeks after Hitler took power, the first concentration camp opened at Dachau, near Munich. It was originally for political prisoners, communists, socialists, trade unionists, anyone who opposed the regime. The camps weren't secret. The Nazis publicized them as deterrents. Oppose us, and this is where you go. Conditions were brutal. Prisoners were beaten, tortured, worked to exhaustion. Some were murdered. But in 1933, the camps weren't yet death camps. They were instruments of terror. By the end of the year, dozens of camps existed. Tens of thousands had passed through them. The camps served multiple purposes: eliminating political opposition, terrorizing the population into compliance, demonstrating the regime's willingness to use violence. And most Germans knew the camps existed, but they told themselves, that's for criminals, enemies of the state. It doesn't affect me. Until it did. Antisemitism was central to Nazi ideology from the beginning. April 1st, 1933, a national boycott of Jewish businesses. SA members stood outside shops with signs, "Germans, defend yourselves, don't buy from Jews." It lasted one day. Internationally, it was a public relations disaster. Economically, it was ineffective. But it was a signal, a test, and it showed the regime that overt violence against Jews would meet little resistance. April 7th, 1933. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service. Jews were fired from government jobs, teachers, judges, bureaucrats. Over the next 2 years, laws systematically excluded Jews from German life, banned from practicing law or medicine, expelled from universities, prohibited from military service, restricted from owning businesses. Each law was incremental. Each seemed like a small step, but together they dehumanized and isolated Jews. And then came the Nuremberg Laws. September 15th, 1935. The Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg. Hitler announced 2 new laws. The Reich citizenship law stripped Jews of German citizenship. They became subjects without rights. The law for the protection of German blood and German honor prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and Aryans. Jews were no longer citizens of Germany. They were legally classified as subhuman. Who counted as Jewish? The regime defined it bureaucratically. Anyone with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents. Even people who'd converted to Christianity. Even people who didn't identify as Jewish. The Nuremberg laws created a legal framework for persecution, and Germans, by and large, accepted it. Some agreed with the ideology, most were indifferent. A few protested quietly. The regime was testing boundaries. How far could they go? How much violence would people tolerate? And the answer, again and again, was more than anyone expected. While consolidating power at home, Hitler prepared for war. The Treaty of Versailles had limited Germany's military to 100,000 men. No air force, no tanks, no submarines. Hitler ignored it. In 1935, he publicly announced Germany was rearming. The Luftwaffe, the Air Force, was revealed. Conscription was reintroduced. The military grew to over 500,000 men. Britain and France protested. Did nothing. In March 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, German territory but demilitarized under Versailles. It was a gamble. If France had resisted, Germany would have withdrawn. The military wasn't ready for war, but France didn't act. Hitler had violated Versailles twice and gotten away with it. That told him the Western powers wouldn't enforce the treaty. Germany could act with impunity, and Hitler became more confident. By 1936, the Nazi regime looked powerful. Unemployment was down. The military was growing. Germany was rearming. Order had been restored. Hitler was popular. But beneath the surface, the regime was chaotic. Hitler rarely made decisions through formal structures. He encouraged subordinates to compete for his favor. Overlapping jurisdictions, unclear chains of command. It was called working toward the Führer. Officials anticipated what Hitler wanted and implemented it, often without direct orders. This created radicalization by initiative. Each official tried to outdo the others in zeal. Policies became more extreme, not because Hitler micromanaged, but because the system rewarded extremism. The regime wasn't efficient. It was held together by ideology, fear, and Hitler's charisma. And it was economically unsustainable. The rearmament program created massive deficits. Germany was spending more than it had. The economy was geared for war. By 1937, German economists warned the regime, either slow down rearmament or go to war to seize resources. Hitler chose war. Not immediately, but the decision was made. Germany's economy required expansion, conquest, plunder. The regime couldn't sustain itself without violence, and that violence was about to escalate. March 12, 1938. German troops crossed the border into Austria. Hitler, born in Austria, had long dreamed of uniting his birthplace with Germany. The Treaty of Versailles had explicitly forbidden it. Hitler didn't care. The annexation, the Anschluss, was presented as a reunion of German-speaking peoples. Austrian Nazis staged demonstrations welcoming the troops. Hitler drove through Vienna to massive crowds. Not everyone cheered, but those who didn't stayed silent. Within weeks, Austria was fully incorporated into Germany. Austrian Jews, nearly 200,000 people, were now subject to Nazi laws, and the violence began immediately. In Vienna, Jewish businesses were looted. Jews were forced to scrub streets with toothbrushes while crowds jeered. Thousands were arrested, sent to Dachau and other camps. The Austrian population, by and large, participated or watched. Britain and France protested, did nothing. Hitler had annexed an entire country and gotten away with it. So Hitler moved to the next target, Czechoslovakia, a democracy, an ally of France and Britain. The Sudetenland, the border regions of Czechoslovakia, had a significant ethnic German population. Hitler claimed they were oppressed. He demanded the Sudetenland be given to Germany. Czechoslovakia refused. Hitler threatened war. In September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Premier Édouard Daladier met with Hitler in Munich. They agreed to give Hitler the Sudetenland. In exchange, Hitler promised this was his last territorial demand in Europe. Czechoslovakia wasn't invited to the negotiations. It was informed of the decision afterward. Chamberlain returned to Britain and declared he had secured peace for our time. Hitler had gotten everything he wanted without firing a shot. And 6 months later, in March 1939, German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. The Munich Agreement was worthless. Hitler's promises meant nothing. But the pattern was set: aggression, appeasement, escalation. And each success made the regime bolder. November 9th, 1938. A 17-year-old Jewish boy named Herschel Grinspan, desperate and enraged after his parents were deported from Germany to Poland, shot a German diplomat in Paris. The Nazis used it as a pretext. On the night of November 9th, SA and SS units, along with civilians, launched coordinated attacks on Jews across Germany and Austria. Synagogues burned. Over 1,000 were destroyed. Jewish businesses were smashed. 7,500 stores looted. Jewish homes were ransacked. Families dragged into the streets. Beaten. 91 Jews were murdered that night. Hundreds more died from injuries or took their own lives. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Many were tortured. Many died. The streets were covered in broken glass from shattered windows. Hence the name Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, a poetic name for a pogrom. And then the regime did something even more perverse. It blamed Jews for the violence. Jews were fined 1 billion Reichsmarks for the damage they caused. Insurance payments for destroyed property went to the state, not to Jewish owners. And Jews were prohibited from owning businesses. Their remaining assets were confiscated. Kristallnacht was not a spontaneous outburst. It was state-organized violence. And the international response? Condemnation, expressions of outrage. No action. Before Kristallnacht, Jews who could afford to leave Germany did. By 1938, over half of Germany's Jews had emigrated. They went to Palestine, the United States, Britain, South America, anywhere that would take them. But after Kristallnacht, emigration became nearly impossible. Not because the Nazis prevented it. They encouraged it at first. The problem was that no country wanted Jewish refugees. At the Evian Conference in July 1938, 32 countries met to discuss the refugee crisis. Almost all refused to increase their immigration quotas. The United States maintained strict limits. Britain restricted immigration to Palestine. Australia stated it didn't have a racial problem and didn't want to import one. Jews trying to escape Nazi Germany found the world's doors closed. The MS St. Louis, a ship carrying over 900 Jewish refugees, was turned away from Cuba, the United States, and Canada in May 1939. It returned to Europe. Many of the passengers later died in the Holocaust. From that moment, the regime stopped trying to expel them. It decided to kill them. While persecution escalated, the regime staged elaborate propaganda spectacles. The Nuremberg rallies, held annually from 1933 to 1938, were massive demonstrations of power. Hundreds of thousands attended. Military parades, torchlight processions, Hitler speaking from monumental stages. The rallies served multiple purposes. They reinforced loyalty through collective ritual. They displayed military strength. They cultivated the Führer myth. Hitler was presented as Germany's savior, infallible, visionary, sent by Providence. Children were taught to worship him. Adults swore oaths of personal loyalty to him, not to Germany, not to the Constitution, but to Hitler personally. This wasn't just authoritarianism. It was a totalitarian cult of personality. And it worked because the regime controlled all information. Dissent was invisible. Doubt was dangerous. If everyone around you appears to believe, you start to believe, or at least you stop questioning. The SS, Schutzstaffel, Protection Squadron, began as Hitler's personal bodyguard. By the late 1930s, under Heinrich Himmler, it had become the regime's primary instrument of terror. The SS controlled the Gestapo, the secret police, the concentration camps, the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, the Waffen-SS, armed military units. The SS saw itself as the racial and ideological elite of the regime. Members were selected for Aryan purity. They swore absolute loyalty to Hitler, and they were tasked with implementing the regime's most extreme policies. The SS ran the camps, conducted racial screenings, enforced Nazi ideology, and when the war began, the SS would operate the machinery of genocide. In October 1939, Hitler signed a secret order authorizing the Action T4 program. Its goal: murder disabled people. The regime called it euthanasia, a mercy killing of life unworthy of life. The targets: people with mental disabilities, people with physical disabilities, children with developmental disorders, the elderly in institutions. Doctors and nurses identified patients. They were transferred to special facilities, told they were receiving treatment. Instead, they were killed. In gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, the first use of gas chambers for mass murder in Nazi Germany. Between 1939 and 1941, over 70,000 people were murdered in the T4 program. Families were sent fake death certificates listing false causes of death. The program was secret, but rumors spread. Some families protested. A few church leaders spoke out. In August 1941, Hitler officially halted the program due to public unease. But it didn't stop. It went underground. Doctors continued killing disabled patients through starvation, lethal injection, and neglect. By the war's end, over 300,000 people had been murdered in the Nazi euthanasia programs. The T4 program was a test of technology, of methods, of public reaction. The gas chambers used in T4 facilities were later used in death camps. The personnel trained in T4, doctors, nurses, administrators, were later transferred to extermination camps in Poland. The regime was learning how to kill efficiently, and how far it could go without resistance. September 1st, 1939. Germany invaded Poland. Hitler had demanded the free city of Danzig and the Polish corridor. Poland refused. Unlike Austria and Czechoslovakia, Poland fought back. But Poland was doomed. From the west, Germany attacked with overwhelming force. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, fast-moving tanks, close air support, mechanized infantry. From the east, on September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded under the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Poland was crushed between two totalitarian powers. By October 6th, Poland had surrendered. The country was partitioned between Germany and the USSR. This time, Britain and France did not appease. On September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. The Nazi occupation of Poland was brutal from the start. The regime saw Poles as racially inferior. Slavs were to be enslaved or eliminated to make room for German settlers. Polish intellectuals, political leaders, and clergy were targeted for execution. In their first months of occupation, tens of thousands were murdered. The intelligentsia had to be destroyed. Resistance began with educated people, so the regime killed them first. Jews in Poland, over 3 million people, were herded into ghettos, forced into overcrowded, walled sections of cities, starved, worked to death. The Warsaw Ghetto held over 400,000 Jews in an area of 1.3 square miles. Disease was rampant. Food was scarce. Thousands died of starvation and typhus. The ghettos weren't camps. They were holding pens, waiting rooms for death. And the regime was preparing for the next phase. Following the invasion of Poland, special SS units, Einsatzgruppen, followed the Wehrmacht. Their mission: eliminate enemies behind the front lines, political leaders, intellectuals, priests, and Jews. The Einsatzgruppen conducted mass shootings. Villages were surrounded. Jewish residents were marched to forests or ravines, forced to dig mass graves, then shot. Entire communities erased in a day. By the end of 1939, tens of thousands had been murdered. But this was only the beginning. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Einsatzgruppen would be responsible for the murder of over 1 million Jews. Mass shootings. Entire families lined up and shot into pits. At Babi Yar, near Kyiv, over 33,000 Jews were murdered in 2 days. The scale was staggering, but the method was inefficient. It was slow, required too many shooters, created psychological strain on the killers. The regime needed a more efficient method, and it found one. January 20th, 1942. A villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee, near Berlin. 15 senior Nazi officials met, chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Security Main Office. The purpose: coordinate the final solution to the Jewish question, the murder of every Jew in Europe. Not forced labor, not deportation, extermination. 11 million Jews were listed by country. Detailed plans were discussed: transportation, labor exploitation, then killing. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. The decision had already been made. This was coordination. The protocol, the meeting minutes, was clinical, bureaucratic. It discussed murder in the language of logistics. This wasn't a passionate outburst. It was industrial planning. The machinery of genocide was already operational. The Wannsee Conference simply formalized it. By 1942, the regime had built extermination camps in occupied Poland. Not labor camps, not concentration camps. Factories designed for murder. Chomno. Opened December 1941. Jews were loaded into gas vans. Exhaust fumes piped into sealed cargo areas. They died while the van drove to burial pits. Bełżec, Sobibor, Treblinka. Part of action. Reinhard, named after Reinhard Heydrich. Purpose-built death camps. Victims arrived by train, told they were being resettled. Stripped. Herded into gas chambers disguised as showers. Killed with carbon monoxide from engines. Bodies burned in open pits. Later, in crematoria. At Treblinka, over 800,000 people were murdered in 13 months. Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest, both a labor camp and an extermination center. Victims arrived by train. SS doctors conducted selections on the platform. Those deemed fit for work were sent to labor. The rest, children, the elderly, the weak, sent directly to gas chambers. The gas used was Zyklon B, a cyanide-based pesticide. Victims were told they were being deloused, crammed into chambers, the doors sealed, pellets dropped through vents. Death took minutes. Then the bodies were dragged out, gold teeth extracted, hair cut for industrial use, bodies burned. The crematoria ran day and night. At Auschwitz, over 1 million people were murdered. 90% were Jews. Between 1941 and 1945, the Nazi regime murdered 6 million Jews, 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population. Men, women, children, entire families, entire communities. This wasn't collateral damage. It wasn't a byproduct of war. It was the goal. The regime diverted resources from the war effort to killing Jews. Trains that could have moved troops carried victims to death camps. Guards who could have fought were stationed at camps. The genocide was central to the regime, not incidental. And it wasn't just Jews. The Nazis also murdered over 3 million Soviet prisoners of war, starved, shot or worked to death. At least 200,000 Romani people, the Parajmos, hundreds of thousands of disabled people, the T4 program and its continuations, tens of thousands of political prisoners, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others deemed enemies of the state. The total number of civilians murdered by the Nazi regime through direct killing, starvation, and brutal occupation policies is often estimated at roughly 17 million or more. These aren't numbers, they're people, families, communities, cultures. Entire Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, which had existed for centuries, were erased. The Yiddish-speaking world destroyed. Synagogues, schools, traditions, gone. The Nazi regime didn't just kill individuals, it committed cultural genocide, and the survivors carried trauma that passed through generations. Not everyone participated. Not everyone complied. There were resistance movements in occupied territories, in Germany itself. In the Warsaw Ghetto, in April 1943, Jewish fighters rose up against the Nazis. For nearly a month, a few hundred poorly armed fighters held off German forces. When the uprising was crushed, the ghetto was razed. In Denmark, the Danish resistance helped smuggle over 7,000 Jews to neutral Sweden, saving most of Denmark's Jewish population. In Germany, individuals hid Jews, forged documents, smuggled children. They risked their lives. Many were caught and executed. There were Germans who resisted. Students of the White Rose distributed anti-Nazi leaflets. They were arrested and guillotined. Officers attempted to assassinate Hitler. They failed and were executed. But these were exceptions. The vast majority of Germans complied, not because they agreed with every policy, but because resistance was dangerous, compliance was rewarded, and it was easier to look away. Many Germans claimed after the war that they didn't know, that the camps were secret, that the genocide was hidden. They knew. They saw Jewish neighbors disappear. They saw deportations. They knew about the camps, maybe not the full scale, but they knew. And they did nothing, because doing nothing is always easier. Between 1939 and mid-1942, Nazi Germany seemed unstoppable. Poland conquered in weeks, Denmark and Norway in months. France fell in 6 weeks. The Wehrmacht reached the English Channel. Yugoslavia and Greece conquered. North Africa contested. The Soviet Union invaded. At its peak, Nazi Germany controlled most of Europe from the Atlantic to deep into the Soviet Union. It looked like Hitler had won, but the appearance of strength masked fundamental weaknesses. The economy was built on plunder. Conquered territories were looted, resources extracted, slave labor exploited. The military was overstretched, logistics strained, losses mounting, and the regime's ideology made rational strategy impossible. Hitler didn't fight for territory or resources alone. He fought for racial ideology, for Lebensraum, for extermination. And that ideology made compromise impossible, retreat unacceptable, surrender unthinkable. The regime's successes came from aggression and surprise. But aggression has limits, and surprise doesn't last. After France fell in June 1940, Britain stood alone. Hitler expected Britain to negotiate, to accept German dominance of the continent. Britain, under Prime Minister Winston Churchill, refused. In summer 1940, the Luftwaffe launched bombing campaigns against Britain. The goal: destroy the Royal Air Force, then invade. The Battle of Britain. For months, German and British fighters clashed over southern England. The Luftwaffe had more planes, but the RAF had radar, home advantage, and pilots fighting for survival. By October, the Luftwaffe had lost over 1,800 aircraft. The RAF lost around 1,000. Germany gave up. The invasion was postponed indefinitely. It was the first time Nazi Germany had failed to achieve a military objective. Britain's survival proved Germany wasn't invincible, and it kept the war going. June 22, 1941. Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. Over 3 million German troops, supported by Finnish, Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian forces. Hitler's goal: destroy the Soviet Union, seize its resources, exterminate Jews and communists, enslave the Slavic population. This wasn't just war, it was ideological extermination. The invasion was initially devastating for the Soviets. Entire armies encircled, millions of prisoners taken. The Wehrmacht advanced hundreds of miles in weeks. By December, German forces were within sight of Moscow. But the Soviets didn't collapse. They retreated, scorched the earth, fought on, and winter came. The Wehrmacht wasn't prepared for the Russian winter. Troops lacked winter clothing, vehicles froze, supply lines stretched to breaking. The Soviets counterattacked in December. German forces were pushed back from Moscow. For the first time, the Wehrmacht had been stopped, beaten, on the defensive, and the Soviet Union wasn't going to surrender. The Nazi war machine was built on exploitation. Conquered territories were stripped of resources, food, raw materials, industrial output, and labor. Millions of people from occupied Europe were forced into labor. Some worked in factories, some in mines, some on farms. Conditions were brutal: starvation rations, no safety equipment, no medical care. Those who couldn't work were killed, replaced. By 1944, forced laborers made up 26% of the German workforce, over 8 million people. The regime also used concentration camp labor. Prisoners worked for German companies: IG Farben, Siemens, Krupp, BMW. They were worked to death. When they died, they were replaced. This wasn't just exploitation, it was slavery. And when slaves died, the regime called it destruction through labor. The German economy was addicted to plunder and slavery. Without conquest, it would collapse. So the regime had to keep fighting, even when it was losing. Summer 1942. Germany launched a new offensive in the Soviet Union. The goal: capture the Caucasus oil fields, and the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. Stalingrad was strategic, but it also bore Stalin's name. Hitler was obsessed with capturing it. In August, German forces reached the city. What followed was 5 months of the most brutal urban warfare in history, fighting block by block, building by building, room by room. The Soviets refused to yield. German forces were ground down. Supplies ran low. The Soviet winter arrived. In November, the Soviets launched a counteroffensive. They encircled the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad. Over 250,000 German troops trapped. Hitler ordered them to fight to the death. No retreat. They ran out of ammunition, food, medical supplies. Thousands froze or starved. In February 1943, the survivors surrendered. 91,000 men. Most died in Soviet captivity. Stalingrad was the turning point of the war in the East. The Wehrmacht never recovered. From that point, the Soviets advanced west, and the myth of German invincibility was shattered. In North Africa, German and Italian forces under Erwin Rommel fought British and Commonwealth troops for control of Egypt and the Suez Canal. Initially successful, Rommel's forces were eventually defeated at El Alamein in November 1942. In May 1943, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered, over 250,000 prisoners. In July 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily, then Italy. Italy, Germany's main ally, collapsed. Mussolini was overthrown in July. Italy surrendered in September. Germany occupied northern Italy and turned it into a battleground. But Italy was lost as an ally. The Axis was falling apart. Beginning in 1942, Britain and later the United States launched massive bombing campaigns against Germany. The goal: destroy German industry, disrupt transportation, demoralize the population. Entire cities were devastated. Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, Berlin. In Hamburg in July 1943, Allied bombing created a firestorm. Temperatures reached 800 degrees Celsius. 42,000 civilians died. In Dresden in February 1945, over 25,000 died in firestorms. The bombing campaigns didn't break German morale, but they destroyed infrastructure, killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, diverted resources to air defense. Germany was being systematically destroyed from the air. July 20th, 1944. A group of German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed a bomb in Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. The bomb exploded. Hitler survived. He was injured but alive. The conspirators were arrested, tortured, tried before a show court. Many were hanged with piano wire, slow strangulation, while being filmed. Over 5,000 people were executed in the aftermath. Anyone connected to the plot. Anyone suspected of dissent. The regime was paranoid, fragmenting, eating itself. And Hitler, now convinced of his own destiny, believed he'd been saved by Providence to complete his mission. He would fight to the end, no matter the cost. June 6th, 1944. The Allies landed in Normandy. D-Day. Over 150,000 troops, thousands of ships, air superiority. The Atlantic Wall, Germany's coastal defenses, was breached. German forces fought fiercely. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and couldn't call in reinforcements fast enough. Hitler, believing the main invasion would come at Calais, held back reserves. By August, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy. Paris was liberated. By September, Allied troops reached the German border. From the west, the Allies advanced. From the east, the Soviets advanced. Germany was being crushed between two fronts. By late 1944, the war was lost. Everyone knew it, except Hitler. The economy was in ruins, cities bombed, industry destroyed, transportation networks shattered. The military was exhausted, losses irreplaceable. By 1945, Germany was conscripting old men and children. The regime's response: fight harder. Retreat was treason. Surrender was cowardice. In the final months, the regime executed its own soldiers for defeatism. Thousands were hanged or shot for retreating, for questioning orders, for suggesting surrender. Even as Soviet tanks rolled through German cities, the regime demanded total war, and it was willing to destroy Germany to avoid defeat. March 19, 1945. Hitler issued the Nero Decree. Germany was losing. Hitler ordered the destruction of all infrastructure: bridges, factories, power plants, food supplies. If Germany couldn't win, it would be destroyed. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, convinced local commanders to ignore the order. Many did, but the decree revealed Hitler's mindset. If the German people couldn't win, they deserved to perish. The regime had turned on its own country. April 1945. Soviet forces entered Berlin. The city was defended by exhausted Wehrmacht remnants, SS units, and the Volkssturm, a militia of old men and boys. Fighting was house to house. The Soviets advanced block by block. Hitler remained in the Führerbunker, 15 meters underground, isolated, delusional. He issued orders to non-existent armies, blamed generals for betrayals, talked of wonder weapons that would turn the tide. On April 29th, he married Eva Braun, dictated his political testament, blamed Jews for the war. On April 30th, Soviet forces were blocks away. Hitler shot himself. Eva Braun took cyanide. Their bodies were burned in a shell crater. On May 2nd, Berlin surrendered. On May 7th, Germany signed unconditional surrender. On May 8th, the war in Europe ended. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Germany lay in ruins, cities destroyed. Berlin was rubble. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, devastated by bombing. 70% of housing stock in major cities damaged or destroyed. The economy had collapsed. Industrial production was near zero. Currency worthless. Transportation networks shattered. Bridges blown. Railways unusable. Millions were homeless. 7.5 million German soldiers were dead. Hundreds of thousands of civilians killed in bombing raids. Millions more had fled or been expelled from Eastern Europe. Famine loomed. Agriculture disrupted. Supply chains broken. The country was occupied, split into 4 zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Germany no longer existed as a sovereign state, and as Allied forces advanced through Europe, they discovered the camps. Soviet forces liberated Majdanek in July 1944, Auschwitz in January 1945. American and British forces liberated camps in the West: Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, Mauthausen. What they found defied comprehension: piles of corpses, survivors, skeletal, barely alive, mass graves, gas chambers, crematoria still containing human remains. At Bergen-Belsen, British forces found 10,000 unburied bodies and 60,000 prisoners, many dying of typhus and starvation. Thousands died even after liberation, too weak to recover. Soldiers who'd seen combat were traumatized by what they witnessed. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces, visited a camp. He ordered extensive documentation, photographs, film, testimony. He wrote, "The things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering. He insisted German civilians from nearby towns tour the camps, see what had been done in their name. Many Germans claimed they didn't know. The evidence said otherwise." November 20th, 1945. The International Military Tribunal convened in Nuremberg, the city where the Nazis had staged their propaganda rallies. 24 Nazi leaders were indicted for crimes against peace, planning and waging aggressive war crimes, violations of the laws of war, crimes against humanity, the Holocaust, and other atrocities. It was the first time in history that leaders were held legally accountable for such crimes on an international stage. The trial lasted nearly a year. Evidence was presented, testimony heard, film footage from the camps shown. The defendants claimed they were following orders, that they didn't know the full extent, that Hitler was solely responsible. The tribunal rejected these defenses. Following orders was not an excuse for crimes against humanity. 12 defendants were sentenced to death, executed by hanging in October 1946. 3 received life imprisonment. 4 received prison sentences. 3 were acquitted. Hermann Goering, once Hitler's second-in-command, cheated the gallows by taking cyanide the night before his execution. The Nuremberg trials established a precedent. Individuals can be held accountable for crimes committed in the name of the state. But Nuremberg only tried the top leadership. Thousands of others, camp guards, bureaucrats, police officers, escaped justice. Some were tried in later proceedings. Many were not. Justice was incomplete. But it was something. After the war, the Allies attempted denazification, removing Nazi influence from German society. Nazi party members were identified. Those in leadership positions were arrested. Some tried. Some banned from public office. Schools were reformed. Textbooks rewritten. Nazi symbols banned. In the Soviet zone, denazification was harsh and politically motivated. In the Western zones, it was inconsistent. By the late 1940s, with the Cold War beginning, the Allies prioritized rebuilding over purges. Many former Nazis quietly integrated back into society. Some held positions in government, business, and academia in both East and West Germany. This was pragmatic, but it meant many perpetrators were never held accountable. In 1949, Germany was formally divided into 2 states: the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, democratic, allied with the United States; the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, communist, allied with the Soviet Union. The division would last 40 years. In 1946, German philosopher Karl Jaspers wrote The Question of German Guilt. He distinguished 4 types of guilt: criminal guilt, those who committed crimes, the murderers, the guards, the administrators of genocide; political guilt, those who supported or enabled the regime, who voted for the Nazis, who joined the party, who enforced its policies; moral guilt, those who knew and did nothing, who looked away, who prioritized their safety over others' lives; metaphysical guilt, the guilt of being human and failing to do everything possible to prevent atrocity. Jaspers argued that criminal guilt required legal accountability. Political guilt required acknowledgement and exclusion from power. Moral guilt required personal reflection and responsibility. But most Germans in the immediate post-war years didn't engage with guilt. They focused on survival, rebuilding, moving forward. The full reckoning with the Nazi past would take decades. So why did Nazi Germany fall? Nazi Germany collapsed because it was built on lies, violence, and contradictions that made long-term survival impossible. The Nazi economy was never sustainable. From the beginning, it was built on deficit spending, rearmament, and theft. The regime needed conquest to pay for itself, seizing gold, looting art, expropriating Jewish property, plundering occupied territories. When expansion stopped, the economy would collapse. This created a logic of perpetual war. The regime had to keep fighting, keep conquering, or face economic ruin. By 1944, Germany was spending more than it had. The regime couldn't stop fighting without collapsing economically, but it couldn't keep fighting without collapsing militarily. It was trapped. The Wehrmacht achieved early successes through surprise, aggression, and tactical innovation. But the regime's ideology made long-term strategy impossible. Hitler micromanaged military decisions, overruled generals, refused to allow retreats, insisted on holding every inch of territory. Decisions were made based on ideology, not military logic. The invasion of the Soviet Union wasn't just about resources. It was about exterminating Bolshevism and Jews. The regime diverted resources from the war effort to the Holocaust. Trains that could have moved troops carried victims to death camps. Soldiers who could have fought were stationed at camps as guards. The regime prioritized genocide over victory. And as the war turned against Germany, Hitler's refusal to accept reality made defeat inevitable. He rejected peace negotiations, refused conditional surrender, demanded total victory or total destruction. The regime chose annihilation over compromise. Nazi ideology was based on racial superiority. Germans were the master race. Slavs, Jews, and others were subhuman. This ideology made it impossible to win. In occupied territories, the regime brutalized populations that might have cooperated. Ukrainians and others initially welcomed German troops as liberators from Soviet oppression. The Nazis responded with massacres, enslavement, and genocide. They turned potential allies into partisans. Resistance movements across Europe tied down German troops and sabotaged supply lines. The regime couldn't compromise, couldn't adapt, couldn't accept that its racial theories were nonsense, and that rigidity guaranteed defeat. World War II, caused by Nazi Germany's aggression, killed roughly 70 to 85 million people, tens of millions in Europe, 27 million in the Soviet Union alone. More than half were civilians. 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. 3 million Soviet POWs killed through starvation, exposure, and execution. Hundreds of thousands of Romani people. Millions of Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and others killed in massacres, reprisals, and forced labor. These aren't numbers. They're people, families, communities, cultures. The Nazi regime didn't just kill individuals, it committed cultural genocide, and the survivors carried trauma that passed through generations. 80 years after Nazi Germany's collapse, why does this history still matter? Because the conditions that allowed the Nazis to come to power haven't disappeared. The Weimar Republic was a democracy. It had a constitution, elections, political parties, a free press. It collapsed in less than 15 years through legal means. Elections, emergency decrees, enabling acts. Democracy died because people chose to abandon it. Some actively supported authoritarianism. Most were passive. They didn't think it could happen, didn't think it would affect them, didn't act until it was too late. The Nazis didn't start with death camps. They started with rhetoric. Jews were blamed for Germany's problems. Economic crisis, military defeat, cultural decay. At first it was words, then laws, then violence, then genocide. Dehumanization is a process. It happens incrementally. First, a group is labeled as different, then as dangerous, then as subhuman, then as a problem to be solved. These patterns have appeared in different places, in different forms. Whenever a political movement defines an entire group of people as the enemy, the warning signs are flashing. One of the most disturbing lessons from Nazi Germany: the perpetrators were ordinary people, not monsters, not demons, ordinary people. Bureaucrats who processed deportation orders, train operators who transported victims, factory owners who used slave labor, guards who ran camps. They had families, hobbies. They went to church. They loved their children. And they participated in genocide. Some were ideologues, true believers, but many were just following orders, doing their jobs, prioritizing their careers, staying out of trouble. The Nazi regime functioned because millions of people made small compromises, looked away, told themselves it wasn't their responsibility. Many people, in those conditions, chose safety and conformity. The question is, what are you willing to resist now? If you've watched this far, you now know how Nazi Germany collapsed. You know how democracy died, how propaganda worked, how ordinary people participated in atrocity, how a regime built on lies imploded. That knowledge is a responsibility. The trap is thinking modern societies are immune. By the time concentration camps existed, the mechanisms to stop them were gone. Resistance has to happen early, when laws are being changed, when norms are being eroded, when rhetoric turns violent. Not later. Not when it's undeniable. By then it's too late. The Nazis promised a 1,000-year Reich. They got 12 years. 12 years was enough to start a war that killed tens of millions. Murder 6 million Jews in industrialized genocide. Destroy an entire continent. The Nazis didn't fail because they lacked technology or resources. They failed because their ideology was incompatible with reality. But before they failed, they inflicted unimaginable suffering. Authoritarianism collapses. Eventually. But eventually isn't soon enough. Nazi Germany didn't fall because it was defeated by a superior moral force. It fell because it was built on lies that couldn't sustain reality. An economy based on plunder, a military strategy based on ideology, a government based on terror, a worldview based on hate. The regime that promised to last 1,000 years burned itself out in 12. Survivors still live with trauma. Descendants still carry loss. Nations still grapple with guilt and responsibility. The collapse was inevitable. The rise was preventable. Empires built on hate destroy themselves, but they take millions with them. Those millions deserved people who resisted earlier, who spoke louder, who refused to comply. They deserved a world that said never again before it was too late. We owe them that, and we owe it to the future. Because the story of Nazi Germany isn't just history, it's a warning. And warnings are only useful if we listen.